The school hallway echoed with laughter until frantic footsteps broke the calm. Before we dive into the story, tell us where you're watching from. A young girl burst into the nurse's office, clutching her chest, her face pale with terror. "My heart is going to explode," she cried. The nurse moved quickly, shifting from routine attentiveness to urgent concern. What happened next would test her instincts and reveal the hidden weight children sometimes carry, turning an ordinary school morning into something unforgettable. In just moments, the quiet sanctuary of the nurse's office would become the stage for fear, confusion, and the first glimpse of a deeper truth. The nurse's office door sprang open, startling the quiet room. A young girl stood in the doorway, trembling, her small hands pressed tight against her chest. Each breath was uneven, almost shaky, as she took a few steps forward. Her eyes, wide with fear, seemed to plead without words. The nurse rose quickly, pushing aside the paperwork on her desk. She caught sight of the child's pale face and the way her knuckles turned white as she gripped her sweater. When the girl finally spoke, her words were barely above a whisper. "It feels like my heart is beating too fast. Like it might burst." The nurse felt a sharp pull of concern. Her mind ran through worst-case possibilities, as any professional might when confronted with sudden distress. Whatever the cause, it needed her full attention. She began her first steps. She checked quickly, as she always did, laying a steady hand on the girl's wrist. The pulse beneath her fingertips thudded hard and rapid, matching the panic written across the child's face. She kept her expression neutral, careful not to let her alarm make things worse. The girl gasped for air again. "Please help me. It hurts." Her small body shook as she perched stiffly on the exam table. Her feet dangled above the floor, tapping lightly as though her nervous system had no safe place to settle. Her eyes flickered often toward the door, as if something frightening might chase her inside. The nurse steadied her voice and continued. She listened to the breathing, faster than it should be, yet no obvious block or wheeze. She looked at the flushed cheeks, the thin sheen of sweat on the brow. The signs could point in many directions, but none could be ignored. She wrapped the cuff gently around the girl's arm, explaining what she was doing in simple words. The little one flinched but didn't resist. Trust held, fragile but present. With her other hand, the nurse kept fingers at the wrist pulse, tracking its quick rhythm. Her training reminded her. Children often describe symptoms differently than adults. A vague ache, a pressing hand on the chest, even the fear itself. These could blur the line between physical and emotional causes. Still, she noted every detail. The child's skin felt cooler now, though her voice and posture remained taut with discomfort. "Tell me when it started," the nurse asked evenly, careful to sound calm. The girl's answers came haltingly, each syllable broken by her shallow breaths. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second stretching. Inside, the nurse marked the possibilities. Family notification, emergency call, further steps that might carry this beyond the small office. Outwardly, she stayed grounded, offering a steady presence while gathering what she needed to decide. For a moment, the girl's breathing eased slightly, though her hand still pressed against her chest. Her gaze locked on the nurse's face, watching for reassurance. The nurse kept working, her posture deliberate, her questions steady. What stood before her was more than paperwork, more than a routine school day interruption. It was the moment of decision, whether to treat this as an unfolding emergency or a mystery that demanded closer listening. And in that stillness, poised between calm words and urgent action, the weight of that decision began to press heavier. Her hands moved with steady care, each motion deliberate. This was the moment when many school procedures would point towards swift action, parental contact, and if doubt lingered, a call for emergency services. In this case, she weighed those options, measuring what she observed against what the rule book suggested. She felt the girl's pulse again, steady but racing, like a drum held just a little too close to the chest. It was fast, yes, but not wild or uneven. Her breathing came short and quick, yet the color in her skin didn't match the signs of something truly collapsing. Details like these gathered quietly in the nurse's mind, forming a picture that didn't perfectly match the crisis playbook. The child's complaints still mattered deeply. Chest pain in any form was serious. But she noticed what was missing, too. There was no numbness in the arms, no radiating pain down the back. The little girl held herself stiffly, eyes darting toward the hallway, as though something beyond the office walls mattered just as much as the flurry in her chest. Her fingers brushed the phone on the desk. Policy leaned toward safety. Parents should be called, and rarely was 911 considered too cautious. If she pressed those buttons, sirens would soon fill the air, drawing in teachers, classmates, administrators. For the child, that may have meant a hospital trip, machines, tests, confusion. For a nurse, it meant holding to the letter of the handbook, even if her instincts whispered hesitation. She kept her hand gently on the girl's wrist, pinning the connection in place. The rhythm she felt wasn't changing for the worse. In fact, the breaths were starting to lengthen a little now that the office around them was still. This subtle shift pulled against the louder call of procedure. Her training had always stressed caution. When doubt exists, move as if the danger is real. Yet years of working with children also taught her that fear could build a storm inside the body, powerful enough to mimic dire illness. And so she stood, at the hinge between two very different futures for this girl. One filled with flashing lights, the other with quiet observation and listening. The phone receiver rested again in its place, just for a moment, as she drew in a slow breath. She wasn't abandoning procedure, she was gathering more. What she saw didn't demand an ambulance yet, so she let herself lean into the details, the child's gaze wandering to the clock, the way her fingers clenched, then released across her sweater, the slight easing in her shoulders when silence settled. One sentence cut through the swirl of possibilities. Sometimes the safest path is to watch a little longer. That choice carried its own risks, but it also gave space for the truth to surface. Something small in the room made her pause. A glance, a shift, a timing that didn't quite fit the picture of medical emergency. It was enough to hold her in place, attentive and searching. And as she kept her eyes steady on the child, she began to recognize that the answer might not lie in the pulse under her fingers at all. Her fingers lingered on the phone buttons, then paused as her eyes caught something else, where the girl was looking. Again and again, the child glanced toward the hallway, her attention drawn outward. Each time footsteps or faint voices carried in from beyond the door, her chest rose faster, her shoulders tightening like a small coil wound too tight. The nurse took in the way the girl pressed her hands flat against her chest. It wasn't the pointed gesture of someone identifying a sharp pain, but rather the broad, tense hold of someone trying to contain something overwhelming. Her breaths came in a rapid, shallow rhythm, enough to make her sternum rise and fall with effort. The pattern felt less like the struggle of a failing body and more like a young child caught in the grip of fear. She eased the phone back into its cradle. A shift in thinking was taking shape. Rather than continuing with numbers and measures, she tried something more human. "Tell me about your morning," she said softly. "What classes did you have today?" The answers arrived disjointed, like puzzle pieces handed over one at a time. Math, then reading. We had library. When the girl reached toward what lay ahead, her voice faltered. Words broke apart, and her lips pressed tight as if something held them there. Her eyes darted back toward the door. The nurse gave her a moment, then, gently, "Is there something happening later today?" A hitch in the breath. A quiet nod. Her fingertips pressed deep against the table's edge, small knuckles whitening as her body tensed with the thought of what was coming. The nurse noticed how each mention of the future seemed to spark another wave of discomfort. She studied the shift closely. When the subject was recess or the morning's library time, a trace of calm returned to those small shoulders. But when the talk touched anything beyond the lunch hour, the girl's chest tightened, her hands stiffened, and the shallow breaths rushed back. The color in her cheeks, which had drained before, was steady again now. The pulse beneath her fingers, still quick, never slipped into anything erratic. On one level, the body was functioning, but on another, it was tied in knots. To the nurse, the pieces formed a picture she recognized. Children often experience their stress in their bodies. A headache before a spelling test. A stomachache before lining up for the school play. For this girl, the fear was crowding into her chest, stealing her breath and convincing her that her heart itself was in danger. It was real. But it wasn't the kind of crisis she first feared. She noticed how the girl startled at the scrape of chairs from the nearby classroom. The sound of laughter in the hall quickened her pulse again. Reactions like these followed a pattern, linked less to hidden illness than to the pressures waiting around the corner of her day. The picture now felt undeniable. This was anxiety woven through a very real set of physical sensations. The body was responding to worry, not to failing organs. That realization brought with it a different responsibility. Sometimes our bodies make scary signals when we're nervous, she offered carefully. Have you felt this before? The girl raised her eyes at last. For the first time, recognition softened the fear there, and she nodded. Slowly, her breath began to settle in her chest. If this part resonates with you, leave a comment. It helps others feel seen. The nurse sat back slightly, knowing it was time to change her method. Numbers and checklists alone wouldn't guide her forward now. What mattered was how she asked, how she listened, and how she gave space for the child to answer. The nurse drew her chair closer to the examination table, settling into a softer posture. This was the heart of the gentle questioning technique, shifting from formal assessment to simple, steady conversation. Tell me about your morning, she asked quietly. The child hesitated, then released a small breath. She began to recount the flow of her day: math, reading, science. As she spoke, her hands loosened, no longer tightening against her chest. The nurse noticed how the rhythm of her breathing smoothed as the child described familiar details, the kind that carried no weight. Who do you sit with at lunch? Came another softly placed question. The girl brightened and said 2 names quickly. She described how they shared snacks and traded inside jokes. In that moment, her voice steadied. Her shoulders sank back into a more natural rest, as if the tension had been folded away for a short while. The signs of panic drained when the subject matter felt safe. When the questions touched on what was ahead, though, the change was unmistakable. The nurse asked about the afternoon, and the girl's breath caught. Her fingers returned to her chest, as if the weight had pressed in again. Her face tightened, eyes glistening with tears that never quite fell. The nurse resisted the urge to press. Just one pause, a single break in her line of questioning, was enough to give the girl a little room. Instead of asking directly about what lay ahead, she let topics drift back to neutral ground. They spoke of pets. The child's pulse settled again. They spoke of favorite books and light moments in the library. Her breathing slowed back to something close to normal. When the talk brushed against after-school routines, the fragile calm dissolved once more. The contrast was clear. Safe memories granted her ease, while the mention of looming obligations pulled her body taut again. It was like watching the swing of a pendulum, each topic sending signals through the child's body before she could find words for what she felt. The nurse offered one gentle bridge. Some days feel heavier than others. Today might feel like one of those. The girl nodded quickly, her wide eyes saying more than she could explain aloud. Her hand pressed harder against her chest, the gesture doubling as both symptom and shield. The conflict sat plainly. She wanted to name the truth, but couldn't yet. Silence filled the small office for a long moment. Only the faint hum of the equipment and the tick of the clock carried through. The nurse waited, her presence steady, while the girl's gaze drifted across the room and back again. What emerged was a recognizable pattern. The physical reactions weren't random flashes. They rose and faded depending on what corner of her day was under the spotlight. The body had become the outlet for what the girl's voice could not yet convey. The realization drew the nurse into an attentive stillness. She continued with open questions, always light enough for the child to step into at her own pace. Each answer revealed more of the unspoken link between her emotions and her body's alarms. When the girl finally looked up, there was something in her eyes, an early recognition, a dawning awareness that what frightened her chest might actually live in her feelings. The pathway between the two was becoming clearer with every exchange. The nurse let that moment stand, knowing the next clue to the child's fear could come from the smallest detail. And it was in that quiet that she finally noticed something she had overlooked before. The nurse's eyes drifted toward a small detail on the girl's collar, a numbered pin, white with black digits. It caught the light against the fabric, the kind often worn by contestants at school events. Keeping her tone gentle, she remarked, "That's an interesting pin you have there. Are you part of something special today?" The girl's hand shot up to her collar as if she hadn't realized it was still there. Her breath hitched, quickening again, the fragile calm between them collapsing. She lowered her gaze to her lap, shoulders braced tight. "It's for the spelling bee," she whispered. The room seemed to tilt with that one word. Her face flushed as she spoke more, the words rushing as though they had been waiting behind a locked door. "I'm supposed to go third. I practiced all week. My mom quizzed me after dinner every night." Her fingers tangled together in her lap, twisting hard. She began describing the stage. The way the microphone made her voice echo strangely, louder and thinner than she expected. How the audience, even from a few rows away, appeared to keep growing every time she looked out from the steps. And then the judges' faces, calm and unreadable, their expressions never shifting, no matter how carefully she spelled a word. The image alone was enough to tighten her voice again, words catching between shallow breaths. "The other kids are really good," she admitted at last, her voice trembling. "Some of them won last year. They don't even look nervous." Her chest rose sharply, each inhale too quick. Then came the explanation of how all this began. She told of standing outside the auditorium, the hallway echoing with sounds of parents finding seats, teachers talking, the principal walking to the front row. Strangers' voices filled the space until it was no longer quiet at all. And with that growing noise came the first pounding in her chest. "That's when it started," she said. "My heart was beating too fast, like I couldn't pull in enough air. My chest felt tight, like someone was pressing down on it." She crossed her arms over her chest to show the nurse exactly where the pressure had settled. At that moment, the link emerged in full. The timing was clear. Her body had launched into alarm not when she was climbing a staircase or running on a playground, but when she pictured herself under the lights. Rows of eyes fastened on her. The silence of the auditorium broken by her own uncertain voice. The nurse observed how describing the spelling bee stirred her entire body. Her hand struck again, knuckles pale as they pressed together. Her breath shortened. Her eyes carried both dread and shame for reacting this way. Everything about her physical state mirrored the story she told. Overwhelmed by performance fear so strong it felt indistinguishable from illness. Even with the relief of finally naming it, embarrassment hovered close. The child seemed grateful for the chance to explain, but pained that this explanation was hers. She glanced toward the office door again, calculating how soon her name might be called, and whether she could face it. The nurse could see it plainly now. This was not a failing heart, but a frightened one. The spelling bee was no simple contest for her. It was a spotlight, a stage where the possibility of forgetting a letter had grown to feel like real danger. Her body had taken that feeling and rung every alarm it had. What came next mattered. The girl needed to hear that what she was experiencing was not weakness, not illness, but something deeply human. The nurse leaned in slightly, ready to speak in a way that might bridge that hidden understanding. The nurse shifted in her chair and softened her voice. This was the moment for clarity. Not medical terms, but plain words that a scared child could hold on to. She wanted the girl to see that the frightening sensations filling her chest came from the body's natural alarm system, a system built to protect her. "Our bodies have alarms," she began slowly. "When we feel nervous, they send out chemicals that make the heart beat faster and our muscles tighten so we're ready to act fast." She didn't go into names or details, only enough for the child to picture it as a built-in response. The girl's brow furrowed. Her eyes searched the nurse's face. "But it feels like something's wrong." The nurse nodded. "It does feel that way," she agreed. "The body doesn't always know the difference between something dangerous and something just nerve-wracking, like being on stage, so it reacts the same way." Her hands stayed unclenched, her shoulders easy, so the child could borrow calm from her presence. She explained that the tightness in the chest was the muscles bracing, not breaking. She pointed to her own breathing, showing how short, shallow breaths can make a person feel wobbly or lightheaded. "It's your body thinking you need to escape," she said gently. "But what's really happening is just nerves." The girl kept her hand pressed to her chest, listening, testing each word against what her body had done to her. Her shoulders twitched, then relaxed a little as understanding worked its way in. The nurse leaned on an image the child could picture easily. "It's like a car alarm that goes off if someone just walks too close. The alarm isn't broken, it's just doing its job too strongly. Your body's doing the same thing." That drew a trace of relief. Simple, familiar, something she could imagine clearly. Her chest lifted in a bigger breath, as if that story had let her lungs loosen. "They're not going to explode," the nurse added softly, circling back to the child's first terrified words. "Your heart and lungs are working hard to protect you. They just need to be reminded you're safe." There was a pause. The girl's hand dropped slowly into her lap. Her fingers pressed together, then released. The constant checking of her chest had quieted. The nurse reminded her that many people have felt the same alarms. Students before big tests, actors before walking onto stage, even adults before important meetings. "It's your body's way of trying to help," she explained. "Lots of people know what this feels like, even if they don't always talk about it." That recognition softened the child's expression. She was no longer bracing for disaster, but studying herself with new curiosity. Each word reframed her body not as an enemy, but as a partner that had mistaken nerves for danger. The unfamiliar had become explainable. The mysterious had been named. And in that naming, fear lost some of its grip. As the girl sat more upright, the nurse watched her breathing settle. The frantic energy in the small office had eased into something steadier. For the first time since she'd burst through the door, the child looked like she believed the danger might pass. The realization that this was not a failing heart, but a frightened one, carried more weight than any checklist or set of numbers. What unfolded in front of her was not simply medical, it was deeply human. And with that clarity, something began to stir in the nurse herself. As her thoughts settled, the nurse became aware of her own shift. What had started as a clinical evaluation was now something profoundly personal. She felt herself moving from role to role, not just the observer of symptoms, but the witness to a young child's fight with fear. She looked at the girl, still perched on the table, small hands now resting in her lap. Minutes earlier, those hands had clutched her chest, as if to hold her heart in place. Now they lay still, and the nurse saw the courage it had taken to bring them here. This child could have stayed hidden, tucked away in a restroom stall or buried in the corners of the library, swallowing her panic silently. Many children did. But she had chosen to run through crowded halls, burst through a doorway, and say aloud, "Please help me." That choice mattered. Notice how often children hide their fear. This moment shows what can change when they don't. The nurse allowed herself to acknowledge how easily this could have gone another way. If she had acted too quickly, without looking beyond the surface, the girl might have ended up in an ambulance. Sirens, paperwork, emergency staff asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Tests and wires could have reinforced the terrifying belief that her body was broken. That outcome had been just a few steps away. Now, sitting here together, the picture was different. The nurse felt grateful for the trust woven into this plain room with its beige walls and worn exam table. Out of all the places in the school, the child had believed this office was the right door to run toward. That trust was quiet but powerful. The nurse felt the weight of it in the steady way the girl kept her eyes on her, waiting to be understood. Her throat tightened as she noticed the vulnerability on the child's face. It was not the wide-eyed panic of before, but something braver, a willingness to keep looking, to risk that someone might truly see her. For the nurse, that was the exact heart of her profession. She had always known the value of ice packs and bandages, but here was the deeper privilege, to sit with a child who believed she was broken and reassure her that she wasn't. She thought of the other students who never walked through her door, the ones who spent test day in the bathroom, the ones who claimed stomach aches to avoid being called on in class, the ones who wrote notes asking to go home rather than face a room of expectant faces. So much silence lived in those stories. And here sat one child who had broken that silence, showing what it could look like when fear wasn't hidden away. The nurse steadied her voice and tone, staying grounded, while inside she carried the knowledge of what almost happened. She knew how close they had come to framing this moment as a medical emergency instead of an emotional one. The very same symptoms could have spun into a cycle of misunderstanding, if not for observation, patience, and the choice to see more than surface signs. That recognition renewed her sense of why listening mattered as much as technical knowledge. Without context, care could become mechanical. With context, it held the power to change lives. She noticed then how the child's breathing held steady now, her shoulders no longer pinched forward. The fear that had commanded the room was easing. The office itself felt different, less urgent, more like a place where meaning could be made. What remained was the next step. Not just understanding what had happened, but helping the girl know what to do when the feeling returned. And the nurse, steady in her chair, prepared to offer her that. The nurse shifted from talking to showing. She moved her chair closer and sat beside the child, choosing partnership instead of instruction. Theories had been named. Now it was time for tools the girl could use right away. Let's start with something simple, the nurse said. Breathing. That helps calm your body's alarm. She set her hand on her own stomach. Watch what happens when I breathe in through my nose. Her hand lifted with a steady inhale. Now, out through my mouth, like blowing on hot soup. The hand sank slowly back down. The girl copied the motion, one small hand resting on her stomach. Her first breaths were quick and uneven. The nurse kept her voice low and even, guiding her with a simple rhythm. In for 3, out for 4. That's it. Together they tried again. Each cycle grew steadier, the rush of panic shifting into something slower. Next came grounding. When feelings get too big, the nurse explained, we can pull the mind back to the room we're in. She asked the girl to name 5 things she could see. The clock, the table, the curtain, the sink, the badge on the nurse's shirt. Then 4 things she could touch. The crinkle of paper beneath her, the lace of her shoe, the cool edge of the table, the nurse's palm. They built the pattern down step by step. 3 sounds, 2 smells, 1 taste. With each check, the girl's focus moved outward. Her shoulders loosened, breathing fell into a more natural rhythm as she noticed what was real around her. The nurse added one more piece. Words. Sometimes we can change the script in our head. She gave her a practice phrase. Instead of saying, I can't do this, try, this feels hard right now. It doesn't push the fear away, it just says it out loud without letting it take over. You can also remind yourself, this feeling will pass. My body knows how to slow down if I give it a chance. She stressed that none of these things replaced real care if the trouble kept returning. If it happens again and again, she said gently, your parents should check in with your health provider. It's important they know too. The child kept practicing. A few shaky breaths turned into longer, steadier ones. The grounding exercise came easier the second time. Her voice was firmer as she tried out the new phrases. Then came the moment of proof. The nurse asked her to teach the steps back. The girl lifted her hand to her stomach and demonstrated the breathing, counting softly. She pointed around the room, naming objects in order. She used the reset phrase without stumbling. Her voice stayed calm, her sentences even. This was more than remembering instructions. It was showing that the tools worked right there in real time. The change was clear. A child who had sobbed with fear was now practicing skills she could carry beyond the office door. Her body was calmer, her face less tense, her posture upright and steady. These strategies gave her options. Actions she could reach for instead of feeling trapped. Simple tools, but they carried power. The office itself felt less like a place for emergencies and more like a place for learning. The hum of equipment faded into the background. What filled the air instead was the sound of steady breathing and measured words passed back and forth. The nurse nodded as the girl finished her last round of practicing and looked up for approval. The skills were in her hands now, not just the nurse's. That mattered. A quiet stillness returned. And with it, the next question began to rise. The one about what she wanted to face outside that door. The nurse asked the question plainly, her tone steady. What would you like to do about the spelling bee? The child looked down, her face shifting between duty and dread. It wasn't about pushing her onto the stage. It was about giving her the space to choose what felt possible. This was her decision, supported, not forced. The nurse explained gently that sometimes avoiding fears can make them feel bigger, but forcing yourself through while panicked isn't helpful either. The girl listened, fingers tightening on the edge of the paper lining the table. The air in the small office seemed to thicken with her weighing of choices. Together, they explored middle paths. One option was watching the competition first from the audience, letting herself get used to it. Another was waiting until the very last minute to decide if she would step up. Each choice carried its own kind of safety net. The girl glanced up and down the clock's hands, her tapping fingers keeping pace with time slipping away. The weight of deciding was clear, but this time she wasn't alone inside it. The nurse reminded her of the coping skills they'd just practiced. The breathing pattern, the grounding steps, the reset phrases. These were tools she could use right there on the stage, which meant she wouldn't walk in empty-handed. That thought shifted the picture. Now she wasn't helpless. She had steps to meet the fear. "I could come with you," the nurse offered. "I can stand where you'll see me. Sometimes that makes it easier." The child's eyes flickered, considering. The presence of someone steady in the crowd could open space between fear and performance. They kept it simple with a quiet plan. If she needed to stop, she could make eye contact with the nurse and tap her elbow twice. No words, no scene. Just a small, clear signal. That one idea seemed to bring her a breath of relief, as though knowing she could step back if it felt unbearable had already lifted part of the burden. The conversation began to turn. No longer was it, should I or shouldn't I, but how might I do this if I try? They talked through details, the microphone, the waiting line, how pausing before spelling a word was allowed. Each spoke detail was a step toward shrinking the unknown into something manageable. The nurse repeated that it was entirely her choice. "Your teachers will understand if you're not ready today," she said. "There will be other spelling bees, other times to step forward when you feel stronger." The message was meant to clear the pressure, to show that courage didn't only mean competing, it also meant knowing when to pause. The girl listened with a posture that had shifted. Her breathing was steady now, her back a little straighter. She wasn't bracing against something happening to her. She was preparing to decide what she would do. She nodded, cautiously. The plan became clear. She would walk with the nurse to the auditorium. At the door, she would take another measure, of herself, of the moment. If she felt able, she would try. If not, she could sit and watch. The change was visible to the nurse. What had begun as a rush of panic now unfolded into a series of small, chosen steps. Not a spotlight forcing her forward. Not an escape dragging her back. Something balanced in between. This balance carried weight. A child was no longer cornered by fear, but supported in deciding how to meet it. The nurse knew that choice itself was a strategy. Learning to say yes, to say maybe, to say later. Choices that stretched far beyond this afternoon's competition. As they rose from the table and walked together toward the hallway, the little girl touched her chest once, almost checking, then let her hand fall to her side. She breathed carefully, matching her pace to the nurse's steady step. And though the auditorium was still ahead of them, the nurse understood the decision wasn't the end of the story. The next step would be letting others into this moment, so support didn't rest on her shoulders alone. The nurse reached for the phone, her movements steady. The call wasn't just about relaying an incident. It was about inviting the parents into a shared effort to build support around their daughter instead of passing on worry. When a parent answered, she set the tone right away. "I want to share what we saw today and how we helped," she said calmly. She explained that their daughter had come in frightened, with a racing heartbeat and shortness of breath. She let that sink in, her silence giving space for concern, before she continued. "She's safe now," the nurse assured them, keeping her phrasing clear. "We worked on breathing and calming exercises together, and she was able to settle." She framed the moment not as a crisis that had passed, but as an important signal they could all learn from. Then she offered the fuller picture. "What we're seeing looks like anxiety showing up in her body. Real and very strong feelings, but not a sign that her heart is failing." She emphasized that the fear had been intense and physical, and just as real as any pain. It wasn't imagined or exaggerated. Naming it this way gave weight to the child's experience, without sparking unnecessary panic. She also made sure to highlight the strength the girl had shown. "She showed real courage in running here to ask for help," she said. "That tells us she can reach out when she feels overwhelmed." That's an important strength. On the other end of the line, the parents listened quietly. Their voices carried both worry and hesitation. They asked how anxiety could set off such powerful physical alarms. The nurse used simple language to explain, describing the body's alarm system, how strong feelings can tighten muscles and speed up the heart, even when no danger is present. She placed it in terms they could picture, a system overreacting to pressure, the way a car alarm sometimes goes off from a light touch. As they absorbed this, memories surfaced. The mother mentioned stomach aches before school recitals. The father recalled how their daughter practiced presentations again and again until late, aiming for perfect delivery. These small stories added shape to the larger picture. The nurse outlined the strategies they had practiced together in the office. Slow breathing with a small count. Grounding by noticing sights and sounds in the room. Phrases to reset thoughts toward the present moment. She encouraged the parents to use the same words at home, making the steps familiar and consistent. What she tries here should feel the same when she's with you, she explained. They talked about spotting early signals, fidgeting, fast breaths, restlessness, little signs that meant fear was building before it reached her chest as pain. Noticing them sooner would make the coping tools easier to use. The parents asked about resources. The nurse suggested they look into age-appropriate books on worry and consider local parenting workshops or community discussions to learn more. She reminded them to keep things simple and steady, reassuring their daughter rather than overwhelming her with fixes. Together, they formed a quiet plan for the evening. How to talk about the spelling bee afterward, no matter the outcome, with words that emphasized effort over performance. The nurse stressed that consistency was key. The same supportive language from school and home could help shrink fear's hold. The call ended with gratitude. The parents thanked her for treating their daughter's fears seriously and for pausing long enough to uncover the root. They appreciated hearing both the concern and the hope in her words. Before hanging up, she left them with one line to hold on to. We'll work together to make sure she feels supported. With the parents informed and reassured, she turned to the next step, ensuring that support extended beyond the nurse's office into the classroom itself. The nurse placed a call to the classroom teacher soon afterward. The goal was simple: to make sure the support the girl received in one room would carry seamlessly into the next. The teacher answered quickly, her voice edged with worry, waiting for news of the missing student. The nurse spoke carefully, describing what had unfolded. She explained how strong worry had shown itself in physical ways: fast heartbeat, shallow breathing, chest tightness. She stressed that these sensations were real, not signs of weakness or attempts to avoid class. The body, she said, often carried the weight of feelings children didn't yet know how to name. The teacher grew quiet as she listened. In the stillness, she recalled her own students. A boy who always asked to sharpen his pencil 12 times during math. A girl who seemed to cough whenever it was her turn to read aloud. Patterns she had once interpreted as distraction or avoidance settled now into a clearer picture. These were small markers of anxiety. Recognition softened her expression. They turned the conversation quickly toward practical supports. The nurse suggested building in a few steady breathing pauses during stressful times, especially before standing at the front of the class. The teacher liked the idea, imagining whole groups of children taking one slow breath together. "It's okay to feel nervous," she said aloud as an example. "Let's take a breath together." That, the nurse encouraged, was exactly the kind of gentle language that gave children permission not to hide their worry. The teacher spoke about carving out a quiet spot in the back of the room, a simple corner where a child could sit briefly and return without fuss. The nurse agreed, noting how small breaks could reset a nervous system before it spiraled into full distress. None of it required an official policy. It was just a matter of everyday classroom rhythm. They also considered making anxiety a normal conversation point with the group, not as a lecture, but as occasional reminders that feeling jittery before tests or performances was something everyone understood. The nurse offered to stop by the class and show easy breathing and grounding steps, framing them as useful tools for any student. The teacher welcomed the idea, seeing it as a way to take shame out of the experience. As they spoke, the value was clear. This wasn't about creating a program, but about a teacher and a nurse exchanging small and steady measures to keep children steady. The teacher admitted she hadn't realized how noisy anxiety could become inside the body, how it could look like illness and feel like danger. With this conversation, her lens shifted. They agreed on immediate steps for the girl returning from the office. Discreet check-ins after the spelling bee. Praise for effort, not outcome. Watching for small signals, but without drawing extra attention. Subtlety mattered. The more natural the response, the safer the classroom would feel. The call ended on a quiet note of collaboration. The nurse hung up, knowing the girl was returning to a space shaped by understanding instead of guesswork. The teacher, now holding a new set of simple responses, felt prepared to meet nerves as part of daily classroom life. And as the office settled into silence again, a new moment waited just ahead. The girl herself, preparing to step back into the world she had left behind only an hour earlier. The girl smoothed her shirt with both hands, then drew in one slow breath before standing. Leaving the stillness of the nurse's office meant stepping back into the rhythm of the school day, where everything moved faster and louder. Her hands stayed by her sides now, instead of clutching her chest. A small adjustment that carried quiet meaning. They rehearsed what she might say if anyone asked where she had been. Simple, brief responses would do. I needed to see the nurse, or I wasn't feeling well. The nurse reminded her that most classmates stayed absorbed in their own work and likely wouldn't press for details. That alone seemed to reduce her worry about returning. The walk back down the hallway was steady, unlike the hurried dash that had brought her there earlier. Now the nurse matched her pace, step for step, their presence side by side enough to anchor her. Students passed by but hardly noticed, lost in their own small routines. At the classroom door, they paused. Through the glass, the nurse caught the teacher's eye. A short nod was exchanged, wordless but clear. The return was planned, calm, under control. The lesson inside never skipped a beat. Inside, the room hummed. Pencils scratching, papers shuffled, voices low as children leaned into their assignments. When the girl stepped through the doorway, only a few looked up. Curiosity there, but fleeting. The teacher folded her return seamlessly into the flow, pointing to her seat without pause. She slid into her place, her notebook and pencil lined up neatly, each movement slow and deliberate. Familiar patterns took over, the rituals of schoolwork soothing in their steadiness. In the corner of her vision, she found the nurse by the door. Their eyes met, and in that tiny exchange, she offered a small smile. It carried more weight than a sentence could hold. Gratitude, recognition, and the resilience of having pushed through a terrifying moment. The classroom carried on as though she had never been gone. Chairs shifted, instructions continued, and her neighbor leaned toward her, whispering for help with a math problem. She bent down to offer an explanation, her voice even, if quiet. That ordinary act, passing on what she understood, pulled her back into the circle of daily peer connections. The nurse lingered long enough to watch. She saw the girl's hand lift with the group during a class discussion. She heard the steadiness in her answers, watched her lean toward a circle of classmates without hesitation. The restless fear from earlier had not vanished, but it lived now alongside tools she could use to meet it. This wasn't only about coming back to a chair. It was proof that fear could flare as swiftly as fire and then ease with attention and care. Returning didn't erase the earlier panic, but it showed that routine could be re-entered, that safety and structure could close the loop on a hard hour. The crisis had softened into connection, between nurse and student, between fear and understanding, between the body's false alarms and the mind's steadying hand. Her desk was simply her desk again, unmarked and ordinary. The nurse gave the scene one last glance, then turned quietly back toward the hallway. Behind her, the classroom carried on. The girl folded back into its rhythm, stronger than when she had left. A little help made a large moment manageable. And for the nurse, the work was not finished. There was more to do beyond this single morning to ensure the lessons held and the support continued. Back in her office, the nurse opened the student's health file and began recording the day's events. The routine act of writing, listing the symptoms, describing the steps she had taken, noting the outcome, was not only for the record. It was to make sure this moment would be remembered if it happened again, building a clearer picture over time. She marked her calendar for short check-ins with the girl during the weeks ahead. These would not be long or formal meetings, but 5-minute conversations before testing days, presentations, or competitions. She knew those were the times anxiety could grow strongest. Meeting in advance might steady the child before panic had a chance to gather speed. The nurse also weighed the bigger picture. Resources in the school were limited. With only occasional access to a counselor and dozens of children needing support, the systems in place could feel thin. That reality mattered. It meant her planning had to stay simple and realistic, designed for consistency rather than perfection. From that place, she outlined one clear step forward for the whole community. She began drafting a proposal for school-wide awareness efforts. Classroom discussions on emotions, staff reminders on early signs of anxiety, practical coping strategies offered to families. These weren't grand new programs. They were small adjustments to daily routines, ways to shift the culture from reacting to crises toward recognizing them before they swelled. The incident with the spelling bee had revealed how easily hidden fears could look like sudden illness. Without the chance to pause and consider, a frightened child might have been sent out on a stretcher, carrying shame along with their worry. The nurse used that truth to guide her writing. She framed the proposal not as extra work, but as preventive care. Teaching children to name and manage their fears, she noted, would save time lost to emergencies later. She reminded herself of the other adults involved. Teachers, who saw these faces every day. Parents, who noticed patterns at home. Administrators, who shaped policy. Support could not rest on her desk alone. She wrote with them in mind, creating a simple plan others could accept and act on. The nurse kept her language measured. She avoided long lists of reforms. Instead, she highlighted 2 core actions: consistent follow-ups for vulnerable students and broader awareness across classrooms. Together, these steps could create an environment where a child's shaky breath or racing pulse was met with steady guidance, not misunderstanding. As she closed the file, the nurse paused. The memory of the girl's first wild-eyed entrance into her office stood in her mind. That moment would have looked very different if she had not stopped to watch closely, if she had not connected the dots between emotion and body. Long-term planning wasn't about grand strategies. It was about making sure that same recognition could happen again and again, no matter which child walked through the door. She leaned back in her chair and let a slow breath slip past her lips. The work of preparation was never finished, but for now the foundation was set. Check-ins to steady one student, proposals that could help many more. It was a step toward building steadier ground beneath children whose fears often went unseen. When her eyes returned to the clock on the wall, she knew time had carried forward for the girl as well. Even now, in another part of the school, the next chapter of that morning was already unfolding. The girl stood in line with the other spellers, her hands resting at her sides instead of pressed against her chest. The stage lights gleamed across the polished floor, and she watched as the first 2 contestants stepped forward. Her breathing was shallow, but not wild. The old pull of panic tugged faintly in her chest, yet this time she had something to meet it with. She shifted into the rhythm she knew, breathing in through her nose, counting silently to 3, then letting air slip out for 4. Again, steady. Again, deliberate. Each cycle carved a little space between her and the audience, between her and the rows of expectant faces. Her shoulders eased, just enough to be felt. The nurse waited where she had promised, near the steps leading up to the stage. Their eyes met briefly. One steady look, one silent agreement. The familiar presence cut the edge of fear, grounding her in the here and now. When her number was called, she walked to the microphone with deliberate steps. Her fingers trembled, but her posture held. She adjusted the stand carefully, keeping her breath moving in and out. The room hushed in anticipation. The judge gave the word. She repeated it back, her voice thin at first. Her stomach flipped, but her breath steadied. The crowd became background noise. Letters lined up in her mind, polished smooth from days of practice. She spoke them, one into the microphone. When the final sound left her lips, the nod from the judges confirmed it. Correct. Applause stirred through the room, softer than she had imagined, more supportive than harsh. She walked back to her seat, the weight in her chest loosening a degree. Each turn built on the last. Each word survived became proof of the tools she carried with her. It didn't last forever. On her 3rd word, her focus wavered. A single extra letter slipped in, and just like that, the bell rang. Her face tightened as the old surge tried to rise. Faster pulse, shallow breath, the urge to run. But she remembered. She paused, caught the nurse's eye, and claimed a slow inhalation. 3 counts in, 4 counts out. The panic fell back into place. She didn't need the escape signal they had rehearsed. She just needed the reset. She returned to her seat with quiet dignity. No sobbing, no collapse. The The mistake felt smaller than the fear had promised it would. Around her, the competition carried on, as children spelled and stumbled in turn. She found herself clapping for them, matching their victories and losses with her own smaller beats of calm. When the final round ended and a winner was chosen, she joined in the applause. Something had shifted. She was part of it, not sidelined by fear. She accepted her certificate with both hands, the paper almost weightless, yet her sense of achievement heavy and sure. The real win wasn't about letters and words. It was about using the skills when they mattered most. She had practiced managing her reactions, and that made the difference. The nurse waited near the edge of the stage. A simple smile passed between them before they walked back toward the classroom together. The girl's step was lighter now, straighter, as if she carried herself differently than she had only hours earlier. This would not erase future challenges, nor guarantee calm every time. But it marked a step toward learning how to face moments like these again, with support and strategy close at hand. Back in the classroom, her smile lingered, tucked away beneath the sound of scraping chairs and scratching pencils. For the nurse, watching it unfold, the morning's events planted something deeper. How much these small recognitions could shape the way care was offered in the days to come. Back in her office, the nurse found herself working differently after that morning. What used to center only on sore throats, scrapes, or temperatures began to widen. Alongside routine checks, she now asked simple questions about stress, upcoming events, or worries. Her intake felt fuller, not rushed. A child's health story was no longer just about the body. It was about the pressures they carried, too. She kept her thermometer and stethoscope ready as always, but she learned to pause before reaching for them. An extra moment of observation, a short question about the day ahead, often revealed what the numbers could not. If symptoms shifted while a child talked, that detail mattered. These small adjustments became her quiet habit. The reputation of her office shifted as well. Students began to see it as more than a place for ice packs or bandages. They stopped in when the weight of school pressed too heavily, even if there was no visible injury. A boy would sit down before a big test, calling his stomachache nerves. A girl came the day of her choir performance, admitting a headache but also whispering about stage fright. The nurse noticed, anecdotally, that there seemed to be fewer vague complaints when students realized they could simply say, "I'm nervous." The small office slowly took on a double role. The tissue box reached for as often in worry as an illness. The exam chair holding as many conversations as checkups. That shift didn't erase physical complaints. It gave them context. A scraped knee could still matter on its own. But if the tears outlasted the sting, the nurse now listened for the hidden stress behind them. Teachers began to notice the difference too. Many started sending students earlier, not just when problems boiled over, but when small patterns emerged. A child erasing work over and over, another asking the same question 3 times in a row. It meant some children got support before they spiraled into distress. The referrals weren't dramatic. They were quiet nudges, shaped by new awareness. Parents also came to see her as someone who would listen without judgment. They might call about repeated stomach aches or trouble sleeping, looking for clarity they couldn't find elsewhere. She offered steady reassurance and pointed to skills their children were already building. Often, naming the link between body and emotion was enough to give the family a clearer way forward. The nurse's daily work blended in new directions, but it still felt natural. A child could walk in with a fever and still leave with practical coping tools. A sprain could be wrapped while also acknowledging the frustration of missing recess. Her medical training had not been replaced. It simply worked in tandem with awareness. These adjustments brought steadier rhythm to her days. Instead of repeat visits for the same unexplained aches, children tried the new skills and returned with more language to describe what they felt. The strain on her time often eased, because conversations addressed both roots and symptoms at once. What might have become a vague cycle of visits often settled into clear, supportive responses. Her office became a space where both kinds of care, physical and emotional, were seen as serious, both worth tending. The balance wasn't about added programs or heavy policies. It was about changing everyday habits in small, lasting ways. Her medical skills and her new attention to emotions worked together to serve students better. And as she grew into this role, one question began to form quietly in her mind. If anxiety could shape the complaints of one frightened child, how did it show itself in the many others across the different ages she saw each day? She began to notice that worry looked different depending on a child's age. The same root emotion could wear a different face in the nurse's office from year to year, and paying attention to those small shifts mattered. Recognizing these patterns helped her tailor how she responded. Among the youngest children, fears often showed up as stomach aches or vague complaints. "My tummy hurts" was a phrase she heard again and again, especially on mornings before performances or big events. Their bodies spoke the feelings their words couldn't yet capture. With them, she found that play or drawing offered an entry point. If a child traced a picture of a wobbly heart or circled a sad face on paper, it gave her a clue to the emotions they carried inside. In middle school, the signs were less about aches and more about escaping. She noticed some students asked to visit the bathroom right before speaking up in class, or remembered a forgotten homework folder only on test days. These small dodges weren't laziness. They were shields against the spotlight. For them, brief check-ins, sometimes at the beginning of class, sometimes during study hall, created safe moments to replace avoidance with preparation. A short conversation could unravel what avoidance had been hiding. Teenagers often showed the most layered expressions. Anxiety might edge out as irritability, arguments, or sudden refusals to try. A slammed book on the desk sometimes masked the same frantic pulse she had felt in a younger child's wrist. With this group, she leaned on reframing, helping them link frustration back to the fear sitting underneath. Talking through the connection between anger and pressure gave teens more room to recognize stress without masking it. It wasn't just age that shaped the signs. Gender sometimes tilted how anxiety showed itself. She observed boys pacing or fidgeting out of control when nervous, as if their energy had to spill into movement. Girls, in contrast, sometimes slipped into silence or perfectionism, aiming for control the moment fear took hold. Neither trend was universal, but seeing these tendencies reminded her to look past the surface and not mislabel behavior as simple distraction or stubbornness. Culture also played a role in how distress appeared. In some families, feelings tended to be spoken through the body: headaches, stomach aches, fatigue. Others showed worry through grades suddenly dropping, or through children clinging more tightly to adults. Each student's background added context, shaping how signs reached her desk. She kept her attention on those nuances so she could respond with care that felt right to each child. Over time, she developed age-appropriate toolkits, tailored just enough to match developmental strengths. For younger children, she made colorful breathing cards with animals that stretched or curled along with each inhale and exhale. For mid-level students, she kept the focus on interrupting avoidance, small encouragements that helped them step back into tasks with a safety net. For teens, she introduced simple reframing, shifting self-statements from "I'll fail" to "This is tough, but I can take it one step at a time." These weren't perfect fixes. They were footholds. She also encouraged teachers at each level to watch for these markers. Kindergarten staff looked for constant clinging at drop-off. Middle school teachers looked for repeated bathroom passes. High school teachers took note of assignments slipping right before exams. None of these signs stood alone, but together they told a story. Naming the story early meant support could begin before anxiety hardened into patterns. What mattered most was perspective. She no longer expected uniformity. Instead, she listened for each child's unique signal: a voice, a gesture, a sudden silence. That approach made space for more accurate support, protecting children from being misunderstood as difficult or careless, when the truth was much simpler. They were worried and needed to be seen. The changes in her office and the quiet adjustments in classrooms around her had results that stretched further than one child at a time. Small acts of listening grew into something larger, weaving their way into the wider school community in ways no one had quite expected. What began in that small office didn't stay contained there. One child's moment of being heard began to spark small changes throughout the school, each one quiet but noticeable. If this part resonates with you, leave a comment. It helps others feel seen. The girl, once so frightened, gradually shared pieces of her story with friends. She explained how the nurse had helped her understand nervous feelings instead of treating them only as an illness. Her friends listened closely. Some nodded, whispering that they'd felt the same racing heartbeat or aching stomach before a stressful day. Having language for it made a difference. Soon, other students started visiting the nurse with similar concerns. A boy came in before a music recital, palms damp and hands trembling. A girl stopped by when a group project felt too overwhelming, her chest tight with nerves. They used the same words they had heard their classmate use, describing quick heartbeats, short breaths, and worry that wouldn't let go. The quiet permission to ask for help spread from one child to the next, passed along in hallways and at lunch tables. Teachers also began noticing changes. They saw students pause for a slow breath before a quiz, or step aside briefly to study themselves instead of pushing until tears came. Some even began building small breathing breaks into lessons. One teacher would say, "Let's all take one calm breath before we start," and the class joined together. Subtle signs stood out more now, too. The pencil tapping, the stubborn erasing, the uneasy silence before reading aloud. These patterns, once brushed off, began to carry meaning. At home, parents noticed shifts in how their children spoke. Simple questions such as, "What are you worried about tomorrow?" joined conversations about homework or chores. Some families began using grounding steps at the dinner table during stressful evenings. Understanding that nerves could stir up physical pain helped many parents respond with reassurance rather than confusion. The nurse's role expanded naturally. Children sought her out not only for scraped knees or coughs, but to study emotions before they grew too large. Teachers asked her about behaviors that puzzled them. Parents called for ideas when anxiety showed up at home. Her office still kept its bandages and thermometers ready, but it became just as much a place for quiet conversations. As more of these moments collected, talk of emotions grew easier across the school. Students began admitting they felt anxious without embarrassment, asking to take quick breaks without fear of being singled out. The vocabulary of worry and calm became something everyone could share. And though no sweeping program was launched, these tiny actions added up. A teacher allowing a pause, a parent trying a breathing step with a child, a student leaning toward a friend and saying, "The nurse can help. You should go see her." Each act seemed small in isolation, but together they tilted the culture gently toward connection. The nurse's careful response in that first crisis had shown that listening mattered as much as any medical tool. That example shifted how others reacted. Teachers slowed down before labeling behavior as careless. Parents looked beneath surface complaints. Students began to put words to what they felt instead of hiding it. The shape of daily school life adjusted. Less about pressing forward no matter the state of a child, more about recognizing both the learning and the living happening in the same bodies. The acknowledgement that health and emotion are bound together took quiet root. It was, in the end, a single student's urgent plea that began this ripple. A frightened girl who gasped, "Please help me," and was met with patience instead of panic. That one act opened the door for countless smaller ones afterward. And as the school adjusted, a larger truth came into focus. Sometimes what children carry in their bodies is not illness at all, but feelings too heavy to name. Children's bodies often speak when words fall short. Stomach aches, headaches, a racing heart. These can be signals of worries too heavy to carry alone. This story reminds us to look beyond symptoms with steady curiosity and care. Sometimes the first step is simply being seen and heard. A child who finds that kind of response often discovers room to breathe, to steady, to try again. If this story speaks to you, share it with someone who works with or cares for children. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.